Glad to hear that.
So welcome everybody on Tuesday afternoon, the 19th. Our guest lecturer today, I'm really pleased to say, Deirdre McCloskey, who has been a faculty member at the University of Chicago, University of Iowa, and at University of Illinois at Chicago in many departments, from history to economics to English to whatever. Originally started out as a very good and prominent British economic historian, and has really evolved into an amazing author and a public intellectual. I had last year, when she appeared before the class, I had passed out this handout, which has, let's see, 11 titles, covers of 11 books she's written recently. As a 12th one, and I recommend it highly, Why Liberalism Works. It's a collection of some short pieces, op-eds and other kinds of columns, Yale University Press. And I learned in the conversation we were having just a few minutes ago, she's got about 3 more books coming. There we go. That one's this fall and 2 more next spring. She actually seems to write more than John Grisham or Stephen King, if that's...
I wish I earned their income.
Yes, yes, we just had the sales and movie rights. So turn the Zoom over to you for your lecture. And if you want to be interrupted, feel free. We'll, our TAs and I or Julie can field the questions, or you can, whatever you want to do. So
okay, I'll be glad to field the questions, but actually be better if someone else was kind of watching who's asking, so that I know when to stop for a question. Now, is my image that you students can see big, or is it small like it is here?
Big.
Big, good, because I have a somewhat involved diagram that I'm going to be showing in a few minutes, and I want to make sure it's legible. Well, I'm glad to be here, of course. I taught for 12 years at the University of Chicago. I taught graduate and undergraduate courses. I was the director of graduate studies for 5.5 years when Chicago had a really big graduate program, which I think it's gone back to having, but there was a period when it was small. I have a speech defect. I stutter. But as I get older, I'm 77 years old. I was born in 1942, if you can imagine such an appalling fact. When I was younger, I stuttered a lot more. And here's my advice to you. I'm going to be talking about the so-called cliometrics, or economic history, so-called quantitative and theoretical economic history that was so prominently practiced at the University of Chicago in the glory days of the graduate program. Allen himself is a product of that. I'm in a sense a product. I was on the faculty, but I was educated, with heavy quotation marks about it, in economics at Harvard. And Harvard at the time, we're talking about the 1960s now, was at a low point of scientific creativity. And although I found a few people at Harvard who inspired me, when I got to Chicago in 1968, I really learned how to be an economist. So I was as much a student as Allen was. And the key to Chicago thinking, I'm going to illustrate in a few minutes, is what we call, I think they still call it in the graduate program at Chicago, price theory. Is that true, Allen, that it's still called price theory?
Yes.
Yeah. And whereas in most other universities, it's just called microeconomics. And it takes a highly mathematical form. And I want you to understand that I'm not against math or am somehow a person who doesn't believe in algebra. But at Chicago, the emphasis was always on applying the theory, applying the microeconomics to real world problems. When Milton Friedman would teach economics, what we used to be called Economics 300 or Economics 301, he would just come in with a newspaper article. And he'd say, well, I read in the Wall Street Journal this morning the following. And then he'd open it some for discussion. And he'd ask people, what do you think? What do you think? And what that did is that the students were encouraged, as we used to always say, to think like an economist. You think, well, God, that's got to be the job of a graduate program or an undergraduate program in economics. But at most universities, including Harvard at the time, Harvard has changed. It's become much more like Chicago once was. The attitude was that economics is kind of a museum of economic facts and ideas. And you as a student, even a graduate student, are just to go look at them and criticize them. Say, oh, well, that's not a very good painting. Oh, that's no good. Whereas at Chicago, the emphasis was on painting the paintings, doing the actual applied work. Not always econometric, but always applied to the world as it was. Now, I have some advice that I always give to classes of this character. This is an advanced class. You've all had some exposure to the Chicago way of thinking and to economics. And here's my advice. And if you use this in every class, you'll make more progress as a student. Start thinking up questions, counter arguments, doubts, unstinted praise, if you want to do that, right now. As I speak, as I make the argument, don't wait until the end when I finish talking to then say, oh God, I got to ask a question. Oh, what will it be? Start thinking now. There's an old Harvard story that I like to tell. Who knows if it actually happened, but it sounds plausible enough. In the 1950s, for the first time, the Radcliffe women came to Harvard classes. Now, Radcliffe was the women's college associated with Harvard. And before 1955, the Harvard professors, male, almost all of them, would go across to the Radcliffe yard and teach the women by themselves. But in 1955, the two were merged. And there was this one professor in the government department, the political science department, who didn't like it. He didn't like having women in his classes. And understand 1955, it's the height of Freudianism, right? Sigmund Freud. Everything's about sex. This was kind of, people believed this. Everything you do is sexually caused. And so this young woman from Radcliffe would sit in the front row and knit. She would knit, make a sweater or something, not take notes. And by the way, parentheses, that's how to listen to a lecture. Find something to do and think it, listen to what the teacher's saying. Anyway, this old professor hated this. About the third class, he can't stand it anymore. She comes and she knits all the time. And he says, he stops the class and he points to her and says, young woman, now remember it's Freud, young woman, do you know that knitting is a form of masturbation? And there's this shock in the crowd. And the young woman, without missing a stitch, looks up and says, you do it your way, professor, I'll do it mine. So that's the the main point of the story is start thinking now. So it was called, this creation, partly at Chicago, was called the New Economic History, or Cliometrics. And it was one of the numerous contributions that Chicago made in the 60s and 70s, to some degree in the 80s, but I don't think, frankly, I don't think Chicago is as creative as it was then. It would be hard to be as scientifically creative as the wider economics department at the University of Chicago in the 1960s and 70s was. I used to eat every lunch with the guys, they're all guys, at the business school who were inventing modern finance. Gene Fama, Merton Miller, Myron Scholes, Fisher Black. Fisher Black, of those four I've mentioned, was the only one who didn't get a Nobel Prize because he was dead. But if he had lived, he would surely have gotten one. So that was that. Analytic accounting studies in the business school were being invented. Over in the law school, the economists were inventing law and economics. And in the case of Ronald Coase, inventing transactions cost economics, property rights. And then in economics, which was very small, the economics department was, in the 1970s, about 23 people. I don't know how large it is now, but I think it's much larger. Is that true, Alan? How large is the economics department? How many faculty?
Yeah, it depends on who we
I can't hear you, dear.
Depends on who we count, I suppose. Larger, 35, 40.
Yeah, see, it's much larger. It was about 23. And 3 of the people at one point were economic historians. So the investment that the department made in economic history was very large. When I first came there, there was an old fellow named Earl Hamilton, who had been a great student of the so-called price revolution of the 16th century, about the coming of Spanish gold and especially silver to the old world. But then there was Arkadiusz Kahan, who studied Russian, East European history and an economic historian. There was me, the young assistant professor in 1968. And I have lots of funny stories about this naive Harvard kid who didn't really understand economics very well, being dropped into this sort of, what would you call it, this boiling intellectual pot of Chicago. But then there was, above all, Robert Fogel, who had been at the University of Rochester. He got his PhD from Johns Hopkins. He got a master's degree from Columbia before that. Until 1956, Robert Fogel eventually won the Nobel Prize in 1993, was a communist, a member of the American Communist Party, an organizer. Actually, Bob told me once that he reckoned that he was always very academic, when the revolution came, he would be the Minister of Education. And then the de-Stalinization speech, so-called, the Hungarian invasion, the uprising in Poland, all these things finally got Bob to realize that Marxism, communism, was not the way forward. And he kind of flipped. He became a free market economist. He had a great deal of confidence that private property and private arrangements were the way to go. He wants to, this won't mean much to you, but he described himself once to me as a Scoop Jackson Democrat, which meant a conservative member of the presumably left-wing Democratic Party. So he hired me. When he hired me, I was at the London School of Economics for a year, working on my dissertation on British economic history. And Bob was in London and interviewed me. A man named Harry Johnson, another famous Chicago economist, interviewed me too. And they, in those days, you got hired completely informally. Fogel called up Alexander Gerschenkron, who was my supervisor at Harvard, the great economic historian, said, "Who you got?" Gerschenkron, well, said, "I got two people." And they flew both of us over to Chicago. And I was the one they chose. So there were 3 out of about 23. But Chicago was created, as Allen has undoubtedly told you, in many, many other ways. The monetary approach to the balance of payments, so-called, that is the understanding of international money as the way Robert Mundell, who got the Nobel Prize, understood it, and Harry Johnson, who didn't, but anyway, and that was a creation. Monetarism, Milton Friedman, Anna Schwartz. Anna, by the way, is one of the women who should have gotten the Nobel Prize and didn't. Milton certainly did. That was created at Chicago. George Stigler, another Nobel Prize winner, was inventing regulatory economics and reorienting industrial organization, the study of industrial organization, away from the way we did it at Harvard. At Harvard, we just counted the number of firms in the industry as though that wasn't endogenous, as though it just came from God. Finance, public finance, was being revolutionized by Al Harburger. And one after another. It was just extremely creative. So it was great to do economic history at Chicago. And I want to give you an example. It's a price theory example. Suppose, as Robert Fogel wanted to do in his PhD dissertation, which was supervised at Johns Hopkins by the great Simon Kuznets, the inventor of modern national income accounting. So suppose you wanted to evaluate the claim that the railway was a really big deal in the what I call the great enrichment of the 19th century, 19th and 20th century. Suppose, as another famous economic historian, Walt Whitman Rostow, believed, the railway was the central invention of the 19th century, and boy, was it big. Suppose you wanted to evaluate that. And suppose you were Bob Fogel, this big thinking, but clear, lucid thinker, and a price theory maven. He knew how to do it. Suppose you wanted to evaluate that claim. Now, Fogel had, and he showed it to me and lots of other people, a term paper that he did for Simon Kuznets when he was a PhD student, proposing his dissertation. And what Fogel thought he was going to do is confirm the importance of the railway in American economic history. Big deal. A large share of national income was caused by the invention of the railway. That's what he started believing. And so he embarked on trying to figure out what the effect was. Now ask yourself, how do you evaluate the importance of an innovation, economic importance? The computer, the desktop computer, the internet, whatever. How do you do it? And Fogel thought about it in this very clear economic way. He said, well, it's like a cost-benefit study, isn't it? You build the railways, you build the transcontinentals, and the rest of the railway network, mainly in the West Coast with Chinese labor, and in the eastern part of the transcontinentals with Irish labor. And then you ask, how much higher would national income be? Or no, let's do it the other way. You can do it either way. How much lower would American national income have been had the railway not ever been invented? Or, I don't know, suppose the United States Congress had passed a law, we're not going to have any of those railways. No, they're illegal, even though the rest of the world had them. Suppose. And he spoke of this using a surprising word. He called it a counterfactual. Now, in philosophy, there's, for the last, 70 years, analytic philosophers have thought a lot about the logic of counterfactuals. And as economists, we kind of talk about them without really thinking very profoundly about them. What'll happen when you impose a gasoline tax? What happens when the price of oil falls dramatically, say, as it just did? Well, in order to assess a cause, you've got to imagine what would have happened without the cause. Now, the railways actually happened. So that's the fact of life. It happened in the United States. And in order to decide what its contribution to economic growth or to anything else you want to assess it for, but we're focusing on economic growth here, you have to ask what would have happened without the railway. Now, I won't get into the philosophical problems with this way of thinking, but you understand from all your economics courses that that's how economists think. They think, well, there's an inflation, and the money supply of, I don't know, Israel or Brazil was increased by 1,000% last year. Suppose it hadn't, then there wouldn't have been the 1,000% inflation per year. Or you imagine you imagine another macroeconomic regime or you imagine, say, in regulation. This is a big problem with thinking about antitrust. Imagine if you didn't have an antitrust law, what the American economy would look like. So counterfactuals are used all the time by economists. Of course, the problem is this, the philosophical problem is this. The world is as it was. The world as it was caused by certain things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, all the causes you want to. How could the world be anything other than what it actually was? If you change one parameter in the model, why don't you change the things that made for that parameter in the model? And you have a problem of infinite regress. You have to go back to the beginning of the world and imagine the universe developing in another way in order for any counterfactual. If you met your girlfriend or your boyfriend, suppose you hadn't, how would that have changed your life? But we economists believe in this. So here's what Bob did. He said, how much lower would national income be if the railways had been outlawed or didn't exist? Now I'm going to hold up a diagram. Don't be alarmed too much. Can you see that? This is the, can everybody see that very easily?
the top half is good. The bottom half is cut off a little bit, Deirdre.
I'm not going to do the bottom half immediately.
And you're perfect.
I'm just going to do the first half. So here we are. Let me see. Let me get, I wonder if I can get a better view, because oddly enough, it's backwards for me. It's mirror writing for me. I guess this sort of acts like a mirror. But anyway, when I tried this with my camera, it worked perfectly well. So I'm going to have to, what shall we say, figure this out. Here's what I'm going to tell you. I have to sort of, this is a supply and demand curve diagram. There's the quantity of transportation here. I mean, obviously, if you're making a railway, that's the product, that's the Q axis, is how much transportation is supplied to the American economy, or is demanded for that matter. This axis, of course, is the price axis. And we at the University of Chicago don't ever put just P, the money price, on the price axis. We always put the real price, the price of transport relative to, I always call it AOG, all other goods. So there you are, the quantity and the price. Now, of course, there's a demand curve for transport, and we're going to assume it's just there. And we're going to say, now look, here's the original supply curve. Am I looking at the right diagram? Yeah. Here's the original supply curve before the coming of the railway. That's the supply curve. This is this one here. Let me do it again. There it is. That's the supply curve. And Bob said to himself, well, okay, the effect of the railway is to push the supply curve out. It's perfectly obvious. If you only have canals and rivers and wagons and foot, so far as passenger traffic is concerned, then you have the supply curve that's closer to the price axis. And now we're going to move it out, and boy, that's great. That's the improvement. Now the question is, I mean, that's the situation. And this, as Allen can confirm, is the way Fogel thought about everything. He did a paper with a famous economic historian named Stanley Angerman, a colleague of his at the University of Rochester, on the supply and demand for iron in the United States in the 19th century. And they did it all in terms of supply and demand curves. Okay, what's the increase in national income when you think of the coming of the railway this way? Okay, now I'm going to take a look at my own diagram because it's mirror writing to me. Let me get it straight. Oh, yeah. Okay, now, it turns out, and I'm going to show why in a moment, that the correct measure of the increase in national income measured at either the before railway price of transport or the after railway price of transport, right? Either it's an index based on, we call it a Lasperse index, early weights of prices, or a late weighted prices, namely after the railway. That's called a POSH. These are just pieces of jargon in economics. Lasperse and POSH. You can remember it because L comes before P in the alphabet. That's how I always do it. So look, the correct measure, the exactly correct measure is this trapezoid. Let me see the trapezoid. Here, wait, I'll improve it a bit by taking out my handy little pen here and doing it this way. The correct measure is ABC. It's one way of thinking of it is that it's the increase in consumer surplus when the price falls from the pre-railway price, which is, let me see if I can hit it right there. See, there it is, the pre-railway price, to the post-railway price, which is right here. So it's the increase in consumer surplus, turns out, as I'll show in a moment, to be the correct measure. And what Bob did, a brilliant turn, this was really clever. And I used similar logic in my own dissertation and then have been doing it ever since. He said, aha, if this trapezoid, see here it is, the trapezoid ABC, is correct, is the correct measure, then I can, let's see, let me get my orientation here right. I can use the post-railway, it's 1890 that he was doing this. Take the price of transport in 1890 and imagine, you can do more than imagine, it's not just a wild guess. You can go to various sources, make sure you don't have COVID-19, Alan. You go to various sources and find out how much more expensive it would have been to carry that much transport, right? Post-railway transport was a lot more transportation. But of course, it was at this lower price because railways were better at transporting a lot of things. So this area, this rectangle, see, A, B, C, D, what's that? You can see it's an upper bound on the correct figure. Now that's crucial. I once wrote an essay about Fogel, where I pointed out that Fogel, being Jewish, although he's raised in a secular family, had access to a kind of a characteristically Jewish way of arguing that you see in the Hebrew Bible. And the Hebrew Bible is filled with overestimates and analogies of this character. And I made the argument that there's a Talmudic style in Fogel's thinking. But in any case, just from a scientific point of view, you can see that the rectangle is obviously an overestimate. And then you could build, if you wanted to, an underestimate, which is this area here, this rectangle. And somewhere in between is the correct estimate. But it's crucial to understand this upper bound thing. Now, why is that the correct measure? Now, Fogel didn't quite think of it this way, or he, at least to put it this way, he didn't actually draw this diagram. But here's the correspond, I'm going to go back a bit so you can start to see. Can you see the bottom diagram, Alan? Help me out here.
Except for the bottom inch or two.
Well, we're coming there. We're going to get it. We're going to get it.
Now we're good.
Now we're good. Notice that this bottom diagram, which corresponds exactly to the upper one, is a production possibility diagram. On the horizontal axis, as before, is the amount of transportation. In fact, here, let's get it close so you can see it. There's the amount of transportation. See, there it is. Whoops, I'm pointing the wrong direction. This is the amount of transportation. And on the other axis is the amount of all other goods. There it is. The amount. So it's not the same dimensions, obviously, as the supply and demand curve diagram, which has quantity and price. This has quantity and quantity. And how do you represent an improvement in the American economy caused by the railways? Well, just as I have here. The solid line you can think of as the production possibility curve before the railway. The dotted line is the production possibility curve after the railway. Now, the two horizontal axes are the same. They correspond. So you can draw from the supply and demand curve diagram down to the production possibility or the other way around. And you can see the correspondence between the production possibility curve diagram and the supply and demand curve diagram. So what you do is you take, I keep pointing to the wrong direction. Let me see if I can get, here, so let me get this sharp thing. This is the equilibrium. I've drawn community in the difference curves. It's just a kind of crazy way of thinking about it, but it's the demand curve. I've drawn, here's the point. Here's the new point after the railway on the new higher outward stretched production possibility curve. Notice that if you don't make any transport, it starts at the same point. If you make only transport, it moves up by that amount, right? So here we are. Here we are at the post railway point, equilibrium point. And here is the old equilibrium point, right? New, old. Now, here's the trick. Take the slope of the tangency here, right? You follow this? Take the slope of the tangency. That slope is the price. That, you know, they're not the same, the two diagrams are not in the same dimension, but that's the relative price post-railway. And then use that same slope to evaluate the old equilibrium. And what you get, you can bring it up here, take these two lines, they're parallel now, and drive them up to the all other goods axis, which is up here. And what you will get is the upper bound measure. It's this rectangle, right? It's in another dimension, don't get alarmed by it. It's this rectangle that is an upper bound on the true consumer surplus. By the way, it turns out you can do this with producer surplus too, and it gives exactly the same result. But anyway, the increase in consumer surplus. So there you have it. The increase in national income is, an upper bound on the increase in national income is this calculation that Fogel actually made of this rectangle. So that's the full analytic bells and whistles explanation of what Fogel did. Now I remember very well a luncheon that Bob and I had in the Quadrangle Club, the faculty club. And I can remember saying to him, Bob, I have a simpler way of making your argument. And he went and he measured that rectangle I was telling you about. And it goes like this. Let me write it down because I forgot to write it down before, but it's not a problem. I can do it. Let's see. Share of transport. Share railways. Share of transport, share of railways, delta T over T. Here's the equation that I told him. I said, look, Bob, I can do your whole, it was his PhD dissertation, this great book, published in 1964, American Railroads and Economic Growth. And here's what I showed him. I showed him this equation. I said, Bob, look, transport is about, let's see, we're all learning how to do this. But anyway, transport is, let me see, I got to look at it again. Oh yeah. The share of transport in national income, this S sub T, is in most economies about 10%. The share of the railways, post-railway, 1890, is about half of transport. And from the price data, you know that the change in the cost of transport was about 50%. So look, you multiply those together, and if you do the algebra, it's very simple. You end up with the change in national income divided by national income, because the share of transport is T divided by GDP. The share of railways is, let's call it R divided by T, that is the share of railways in total transport. And then you got this other T, and what cancels out is the change in transport, change in transport divided by national income. And that's the increase. And of course, what I said to him, the next sentence, having put down this equation, was to say, look, the share of transport is 50%. No, not 50%, is 10%. The share of railways in transport is 50%. The increase in productivity was also 50%. So you have 0.1 times 0.5 times 0.5, which is 2.5% of national income. And that was his result. Now, 2.5, that's how you get it. Now, a couple of points. In the first place, that's small, and it's an upper bound. So the truth is even lower. And that became the basic point of Bob's book, 300-page book. But my simple way of doing it comes to the same result, and is kind of an engineer's check. Does this make sense? Is it roughly correct? If you're doing a static calculation of the increase in national income, and you're not going to introduce economies of scale or anything else, this is what you're going to get. And as he pointed out at the time, in 1890, the American economy was growing as it did for a couple of centuries, per capita at about 2% a year. So it was 1 year's growth of national income. Now, wait a second. The iron horse, the railway in which our ancestors worked, my God, it was more important than that. No, it wasn't. Bob had shown that it was only about 2 or 3% of national income, one time. There's nothing cumulative about this because it's a static model. We call it, in economics, we call it comparative statics. You do it once, that's it. You impose a tax on gasoline, you do it once, that's it. And that's what was going on here. So it's this little, teeny isn't quite the word, hey, I'd like to have a small share of 2% of American national income right now. But still, in terms of the sort of romantic story of the railway and the iron horse, and oh, this made for modern economic growth, and there were multiplier effects and demand of blah, blah, blah. It clears it all away. But the other point is about Fogel himself as a scholar. I think Allen would confirm this. Bob said, no, I had to do the 300-page book. I said, Bob, no, you didn't. You just had to do my little simple equation. And that's the difference between Bob and me. I like, as a lot of Chicago economists do, I like to do these little simple equations. We had a colleague about the time I left Chicago in 1980, a little bit afterwards, Arnold Harberger, a great economist, who should get the Nobel Prize but won't because he was associated with the Pinochet regime in Chile. And this kind of thinking that I just gave to you, my thinking at the Quad Club, was Al's way, Al Harberger's way. Fogel's was to do a 300-page book with simulated canals and looking into the demand for iron and all kinds of things. Now, I'm not making a criticism of Fogel. He was an extremely serious scholar, and that's why he got the Nobel Prize. So that's the example of all this. Now, let me. How long have I got, Alan? How much more have I got?
Another half hour.
Okay, good. We'll now remember. Start thinking of questions as I continue to talk about this. I'll put my glasses on so I can see my notes. So I think this book on the railways and railroads, he called it, American Economic Growth, was Fogel's greatest work. He also did, while I was there, another very good piece of work with Stanley Ingerman, this guy I mentioned before, called Time on the Cross, which was about American slavery. And it was a very controversial subject. Bob, by the way, was married to a Black American. Enid's father came from, I think, Jamaica, but anyway, was Black. And Bob, had not an ounce of racism in his soul or in his behavior. In fact, when Bob was doing research on the slavery book, the great slavery book, he and Enid, well, he couldn't take Enid to the South to do research. She would sometimes help him because in the South, as a Black, she couldn't go into the same hotels he could. And that was as late as the early 1970s. And then after that, and that was a big period. It was very controversial. I was at a famous conference at Rochester, University of Rochester, which evaluated Time on the Cross, the book. And it was like being in some sort of firefight in the First World War. It was simply astonishing. Then he went on to study health in a very comprehensive way, the history of healthcare not just in the United States, in the world. So he got bigger and bigger topics, so to speak. But I think this book alone deserves the Nobel Prize. It was an amazing book, this Railroads and Economic Growth. In fact, just a minor side point, when he got the Nobel Prize in 1993, he got it with another famous economic historian named Douglas North. And I was asked to write the report on who to give the prize to. Now I can tell you, this is inside knowledge, inside baseball. I wanted to give it just to Fogel, but I knew that the Swedes wanted to give it instead to Douglas North. And then very alarmingly, they suggested the third person I should talk about was Fernand Braudel, a French social historian. And I was damned if I was going to let them give it to Braudel. But I saw that in order to get it to Fogel, I needed to compromise on Doug North, who I didn't think was, sure, Doug deserved it. But so I framed the prize as a prize for that these two people had a lot to do with the making of the new economic history, the invention of the so-called Cleometrics, which is a joke on the Greek muse of history, Cleo. Cleometrics, new economic history, quantitative economic history, both of them. Doug was older than Bob, somewhat, not too much. They had both contributed to this, so that's what the prize was for. It was not for, it was not, alas, for railways and economic growth, as it probably should have been. And it was not for Douglas North's turn, as he had made, into property rights economics. So anyway, they observe now. Observe. What have you been told is the way economic science proceeds? Now, implicitly, you've been told, because lots of you have had econometrics, that's the way economics works. We have a theory up here, and we develop a linear approximation to the model. We identify it somehow, and then we do regression analysis down here. And I really think that economics has gotten too much, has done this too much, this econometrics, because in fact, some economists have so little faith in human nature and in how people behave in markets, what we call price theory in Chicago, that they think there's no economic theory that really means anything, and that the only way to find out about stuff is to do regressions and follow them where they may. And I think that's a mistake. In fact, I've written a good deal on the theory of tests of statistical significance. I have a book with Steve Ziliak in 2008 called The Cult of Statistical Significance. And indeed, it was the basis for a Supreme Court case, not the basis, that's a bit of an exaggeration, but it was involved in a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court of the United States decided 9-0 in favor of me, so to speak. Alas, in the opinion, they didn't say, as that brilliant economist Deirdre McCloskey said, tests of statistical significance are silly. But that was the conclusion. So now my attitude, if other economists argue with me about this, I say, look, are you a subject of the United States? Yes, they'll say. Well, I'm going to call a cop because you violated the Supreme Court's decision on this. So it's not statistics alone. I mean, look, I was trained, for a person of my PhD generation, I was trained rather heavily in econometrics. Back in the 60s at Harvard, I had 3 courses in econometrics. But in my work, I've not actually used it because I very quickly discovered that these tests of statistical significance, which run econometrics, are mistaken. Now, at the other end, there's existence theorems without measurement. If any of you go to graduate school in economics, you'll be faced with a microeconomics course, which consists entirely of theorems, proving stuff. And you'll get it in macro too, both macro and micro. And I don't believe that's science. I believe that's, I don't know, it's something else. It's a kind of depraved form of mathematics. And then, not at Chicago, probably not even now at Chicago, but certainly not in the 1970s, but at many other universities, colleges, and graduate schools, people were taught about imperfections in the economy. I just got off an interview with an English journalist, and he kept talking about the imperfections in the monetary system. And I kept saying, no, I've got the Chicago engineering approach. If things are pretty close, that's good enough. You know, demand curves, I don't know. Yes, I believe they exist. I use them all the time. But they only have to be roughly downward sloping, or they can be fuzzy. And so can the supply curve be a little bit on the fuzzy side. Still, it'll work. Still, if there's an interruption to the meat supply, the price of meat will go up. Whereas in other places, like at Harvard in the 1960s, I think probably even so now, they spend in the Ec 1 course that all of you took, they spend a week or 2 on perfect competition, as they call it. They think agriculture is an example. Then they spend the rest of the course talking about imperfections, monopoly, externalities, failures of property rights, ignorant consumers, the whole field of behavioral economics. But you'll notice what Fogel did, and what I do in all my economic work, is simulation. That's what it would be called by an engineer. You get a rough idea, you have the theory, which you believe in, namely supply and demand curves for transportation. You say to yourself, what can I learn quantitatively if I know roughly what the shape of these things are? Let's see. Is there any upper bound or lower bound, if that's what your purpose is, that I can use? And then you go to it and you get the few numbers, these numbers that I gave you in my little calculation, right? You get the few numbers that give you the result. Now, this is how physical scientists think. This is how physicists, chemists, geologists, engineers, this is how they think. The great physicist, Feynman, Richard Feynman, if you read any of his work, you'll find him doing this over and over and over again. What's the rough order of magnitude? That's what you need to know. In the old days, we used slide rules. You probably have not encountered them, but that's how we used to multiply and divide and do logarithms and sine, sines and cosines and so forth. And it was a slipping, sliding ruler. And every step of the way, Allen remembers this, you had to know where to place the decimal point, or else you got the wrong result. So right from the beginning, you always, at each step, you had to know the order of magnitude that you were talking about, or else you got off by 1, 2, 3, 4 orders of magnitude. Whereas now, when you kids went to school, you had calculators. I think it's a terrible thing. You should have learned on slide rules. But order of magnitude thinking is how scientists operate. It's how historians operate, for that matter. They think of what factors caused the First World War, and if they're good historians, they don't just make a long list of factors. They develop, sometimes without being very quantitative people themselves, they develop a sort of quantitative way of assessing, well, it was what's his name, Gray, the foreign secretary in the British government, who was the problem, or it was this, or it was that, or it was that the Russians had to mobilize first because, and this fits with Vogel, their railway system was undeveloped. They had it, but they didn't have very many of them. So just by way of sort of conclusion, let me say, I've come a long way in my mad career. When I was your age, maybe, yeah, about your age. Well, when I was a little bit younger than you, when I was high schooler and first year student at Harvard College, I was a socialist. Bernie Sanders, you probably know. And he was a freshman at the University of Chicago in the same year I was a freshman at Harvard College. And Bernie was a socialist, and so was I. I believed that the problem of the world was capitalism. And since then, I've learned something. Bernie Sanders hasn't learned a damn thing since 1960. He still thinks of the world in Marxist terms. I became at Harvard, what was on offer was Keynesian economics. So I learned Keynesian economics, so I believed it. I mean, I was sort of stupid. I just went along with it. Yeah, that's okay. And then I became a kind of economic engineer because I studied transportation economics with the great John Mayer, who eventually became the director of the National Bureau of Economic, the president of the National Bureau of Economic Research. Then I discovered this fellow I mentioned before, Alex Gerschenkron, the great economic historian, and I got in with those people. We were in a wonderful seminar at Gerschenkron at Harvard And then I learned, and I gradually become more and more of an applied economist. Someone who believes that economic theory, roughly, is pretty good, a pretty good characterization of how the world works. But I wanted, in Fogel style, to apply it, to get the actual numbers. Bob was very tolerant of economic theorists. I'm less tolerant of them, but he was very tolerant. He said, oh, they're thinking great thoughts, maybe something will come of it. But he always wanted to know how big, which is very much an engineering approach. And then I gradually, at a much slower pace, became a libertarian, more of a libertarian economist even than Chicago in the 70s. Then I started to study Austrian economics, which is something you all ought to look into. And by now, I think of myself as advocating humanomics. Bob's brother was a professor of English and a poet at Cornell University. And he was kind of at the opposite end of the quantitative-qualitative spread to Bob. But what I think now is that an economics for the future needs both. It needs the categorization, the qualitative, the qualia, as the medieval, as the scholastic philosophers put it, the quality, the qualities that you decide on philosophically or historically, or politically for that matter. Then you measure, as Bob and I both do, Allen did, we all do, economic historians. Then you evaluate, and that too is a qualitative, humanistic study. So that's my story, but it's very much the story of Chicago School economics. That was a wonderful time. I was an assistant professor, then I got tenure in 1975, so I was an associate professor. I left in 1980 because they wouldn't promote me to full right away. So I moved on, and but it was a wonderful time. It was the best time to be on the faculty, or for that matter, to be a student at the University of Chicago. I taught more. I taught the Economics 300 course, which has been abolished, but Economics 300 was the kind of bonehead graduate course. If you didn't have a master's degree from Hebrew University, you did my course first, then you did Gary Becker, or Friedman, or something or Harburg for 301. But I learned economics by teaching it, I thank God, because had I gone to a Harvard-oriented department like Yale, I would not have become a very good economist. I would have continued this kind of connoisseur's attitude of looking at economic theory, assessing it. I don't know how they thought they were assessing it, but anyway, assessing it without actually seeing if it works in the world. If it works in the world, it's a good theory. That's what Feynman said, the great physicist. So thank you, it's been nice. So who wants to ask a question? Now remember, I told you, get ready.
Anyone want to be first up?
Who wants to be first up?
Let me try one out on you.
Okay.
Gone through controversial things like railroads and slavery.
Yeah.
It was raised a lot, say a year or so ago in the early stages of the presidential debates when there were 20 people on the stage. Or
yeah.
How would Bob think about the issue of reparations?
Well, I think he'd think about it more or less the same way I do. I'm watching right now a very good series, I highly recommend it, called The Vikings. And it's about the Vikings. Hey, surprise, surprise. And these are my ancestors. I'm 1/4 Norwegian, but I'm 1/2 Irish. And the Norwegians in particular, as against the Danes or the Swedes who went elsewhere, the Norwegians came around Britain and descended on Ireland. The Old Irish word for penny is from Norse, which is the language the Scandinavians spoke at the time. Dublin, Cork, and other places were founded by the Norwegians, by these Vikings. So I've done this on this Ancestry.com and 23andMe genetic testing. And here's the fact. I've got too much Irish blood. By family history, I should have half. 1/4 English, 1/4 Norwegian. Very boring. No Jewish, no East Asian, no South Asian, nothing. Very, very boring. No African. I'm very annoyed by all this. But anyway, it's very simple. But what's going on? I've got more than 50% Irish blood. Perché? What's going on? Well, what's going on is that Norwegians brought back slaves from Ireland in large numbers. So who do I apply for reparations? To myself? Look, I tax my right. I mean, this is a somewhat flippant argument, a way of saying it. But you see the problem. Should I tax my right pocket to, give to my left pocket? We all have, what can I say? I'll use a non-economic word, exploitation in our background. If we had women in our background, and there's no one here who doesn't have women in his or her background, women were exploited virtually in all societies. So should there be reparations for that? So I agree with my friends on the left that racism in the United States is a really serious matter. And in this circumstance, I can be kind of smart alecky about it. And if I were really talking to an audience, I would be much more circumspect, because it matters to American history and to America now. We now have a president who's a racist, a straightforward racist. And he's against against East Asian people, he's against Black people, he's against, in fact, at one point you may remember, he said, why don't we get more immigrants from Norway? So that's my view.
I have a question.
Yes.
In your analysis of the railroad, you look at how the railroad increases the productivity of the transportation industry as a percentage. Yeah. How would you incorporate how railroads influence the productivity of other industries?
Well, that's a very good question, and Bob worried about it, and so do I, but it's very easy to handle. Look at it this way. An economic historian named Roger Ransom made this point early on. Roger said, look, if the railway, there are two ways of measuring the effect of the railway on, say, Ohio. One way is to do the kind of calculation Bob did, right? Where you're looking at the market for transport. Another way is increases in rents, land rents in Ohio. And you can, do it as complicated the way as you want. You can get how close it was to the railway and so forth. But Roger pointed out, those are two measures of the same thing. Because the only reason the land rents increased is because transport costs fell. See what I mean? So that's one point. And to include the increase in rents from the fall in transport and Bob's direct calculation of the social savings, as he called it, from railways would be to count twice. And sort of the same thing is true of the claim that, well, the demand for rails, iron and then steel rails, by 1890, steel rails, was a big improvement in the, I don't know, the steel industry. Well, no, that's included in the cost of the railway. In fact, there's another famous economic historian, Jeffrey Williamson. And in this book I was bragging about to Allen, that just got published, where did I put it? Oh, here it is. There is reprinted a review I did of Jeff Williamson's book, in which he modeled the American economy in a computable general equilibrium model, and said Bob Fogel was wrong, the railway is much more important. But I found where the body was buried, and Jeff never forgave me. What he did is he had a railway sector in his model that was just like a tax. And so you raise or lower the tax, and that causes transport. But it was a transport sector, according to his model, that had no costs. So he said, you see, the railway increased investment in the United States. Well, it sure did. The capital output ratio in railways was 10-to-1, whereas in most of the economy it's 3-to-1. The trouble is that as soon as you have a railway in your model that costs something, the railway absorbed all the capital. So there was no gain. So Bob, and then you can talk about economies of scale. Another economic historian, Bob Fogel developed a lot of enemies. I'm not quite sure. He was just a prince of a man. He's a wonderful fellow. But anyway, Paul David, another economic historian, attacked him for ignoring economies of scale. And one snowy evening in Toronto, Bob spent an hour and a half on a speech that was supposed to take half an hour, explaining why Paul David was wrong. Fogel was a very careful empirical scholar, as was Milton Friedman, as to a lesser extent Stigler was. And Al Harburger was this great genius at the order of magnitude calculation.
Thank you.
You're welcome, dear.
Hi, I had a question along the similar lines over here.
Go ahead.
I know that Professor Richard Hornbeck has also done some work on railways at the Booth School, and he's basically only focused on mostly focused on agricultural land values, and how they would have shifted if the railways hadn't existed. And I think he estimated that around the land values would be 60% less in 1890 than they were because of the railways.
Oh, he's right about that.
So, but his estimate, I think, was much higher than 2.5%, right? No,
he's wrong. Look, very interestingly, I lived in Iowa for 19 years. Go Hawks. I taught at the University of Iowa. And Iowa is a very interesting case here because it's very rich land. It's where the glaciers stopped and dropped all the stuff they had dragged from, Manitoba and so on, and dropped on the Midwest. Very thick, very deep soil, very rich, and lots of rivers. So you'd think, oh, well, they don't need the railway. They can use the rivers. But the Iowa rivers are very steep and filled with rapids. You've heard a lot of rapids names, Cedar Rapids. Well, there's a good reason for it. There's a rapids there. So Iowa depended entirely on the railway. Iowa land would be worth nothing because you'd have to cart it to a navigable river, which means going all the way to the Mississippi or the Missouri. And from central Iowa, that's completely impractical. So no, I don't think that's right. I'd have to see this particular work to know what's wrong with it, but it's wrong. Because, if you have the sort of Harburger / Fogel / McCloskey rough approximation, And in all your work, whatever you do, whether you become a doctor or an economist or a lawyer or in business, if you've got the right order of magnitude, then you can hang on it. You can people say, oh no, but look, consider economies of scale, and it'll turn out that they're wrong.
Awesome.
So I
Thank you.
suspect he's wrong, and I hope he's not double counting. So, by the way, see the background? That's the Grand Canyon. I've been down it twice. What I have is a green screen, which allows you to put stuff like that on.
Anyone else?
I am actually in my sister's basement kitchen in Bloomington, Indiana.
Well, let me just close, and I would close if maybe I should tell Deirdre to get off before I close, but it would not surprise me at all.
Okay.
On some early October morning, to listen or hear on the radio that one of the Nobel Prize winners, Deirdre
Dream
McCloskey,
on, dream on. They
wouldn't surprise me at all. Be well.
The only argument is that 2 women have now got it. So maybe a trans woman will get it. But pray for me, dear. Okay, dear. Ciao, ciao.
Take care, and thanks so much.